"Don't affright yourself, Prince," replied the fairy. "You ran a risk in fetching the water of the Fountain of Lions for your father. There's no danger in finding out this man, who is my brother Shebar, but is far from being like me, though we both had the same father. He is of so violent a nature that nothing can prevent his giving cruel marks of his resentment for a slight offence. Yet, on the other hand, is so good as to oblige everyone in whatever they desire. He is made exactly as the Sultan your father has described him, and has no other weapon than a bar of iron of 500 pounds weight, without which he never stirs, and which makes him respected. I'll send for him, and you shall judge of the truth of what I tell you. But be sure to prepare yourself against being frightened at his extraordinary figure when you see him." "What, my queen?" replied Prince Ahmed. "Do you say Shebar is your brother? Let him be never so ugly or deformed. I shall be so far from being frightened at the sight of him that as our brother I shall honour and love him." The fairy ordered a gold chafing dish to be set out with a fire in it under the porch of her palace, with a box of the same metal which was a present to her, out of which she took perfume, and, throwing it into the fire, there arose a thick cloud of smoke. Some moments afterwards the fairy said to Prince Ahmed, "See, there comes my brother." The prince immediately perceived Shebar coming gravely, with his heavy bar on his shoulder, his long beard which he held up before him, and a pair of thick mustachios which were tucked behind his ears and almost covered his face. His eyes were very small and deep set in his head, which was far from being of the smallest size, and on his head he wore a grenadier's cap. Besides all this, he was very much humpbacked. If Prince Ahmed had not known that Shebar was Peribanu's brother, he would have not been able to look at him without fear, but, knowing first who he was, he stood by the fairy without the least concern. Shebar, as he came forward, looked at the prince earnestly enough to have chilled his blood in his veins, and asked Peribanu, when he first accosted her, who that man was. To which she replied, "He is my husband, brother. His name is Ahmed. He is son to the Sultan of the Indies. The reason I did not invite you to the wedding was because I was unwilling to divert you from an expedition you were engaged in, and from which, I heard with pleasure, you returned victorious. So I took the liberty now to call for you." At these words, Shebar, looking on Prince Ahmed favourably, said, "Is there anything, sister, wherein I can serve him? It is enough for me that he is your husband to engage me to do for him whatever he desires." "The Sultan, his father," replied Peribanu, "has a curiosity to see you, and I desire he may be your guide to the Sultan's court." "He needs but lead the way, I'll follow him." "Brother," replied Peribanu, "it is too late to go today, therefore stay until tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I'll inform you of all that has passed between the Sultan of the Indies and Prince Ahmed since our marriage." The next morning, after Shebar had been informed of the affair, he and Prince Ahmed set out for the Sultan's court. When they arrived at the gates of the capital, the people no sooner saw Shebar than they ran and hid themselves. Some shut up their shops and locked themselves in their houses, while others, flying, communicated their fear to all they met, who stayed not to look behind them but ran too. Insomuch that Shebar and Prince Ahmed, as they went along, found the streets all desolate until they came to the palace, where the porters, instead of keeping the gates open, ran away too. So that Prince Ahmed and Shebar advanced without any obstacle to the council hall, where the Sultan was seated on his throne, giving audience. Here, likewise, the ushers, at the approach of Shebar, abandoned their posts and gave them free admittance. Shebar went boldly and fiercely up to the throne, without waiting to be presented by Prince Ahmed, and accosted the Sultan of the Indies in these words: "Thou hast asked for me. See, here I am. What wouldst thou have with me?" The Sultan, instead of answering him, clapped his hands before his eyes to avoid the sight of so terrible an object. At this uncivil and rude reception, Shebar was so much provoked, after he had given him the trouble to come so far, that he instantly lifted up his iron bar and killed the Sultan before Prince Ahmed could intercede on his behalf. All that he could do was to prevent his killing the Grand Vizier, who sat not far from him, representing to him that he had always given the Sultan his father good advice. These are the ones then, said Shebar, who gave him bad. And as he pronounced these words, he killed all the other viziers, and flattering favourites of the Sultan, who were Prince Ahmed's enemies. Every time he struck, he killed someone or other, and none escaped but they who were not so frightened as to stand staring and gaping and save themselves by flight. When this terrible execution was over, Shebar came out of the council hall into the midst of the courtyard with the iron bar upon his shoulder, and, looking hard at the Grand Vizier, who owed his life to Prince Ahmed, he said, I know there is a certain magician who is a greater enemy of my brother-in-law's than all these base favourites I have chastised. Let the magician be brought to me presently. The Grand Vizier immediately sent for her, and as soon as she was brought, Shebar said, as he struck her with his iron bar, Take the reward of thy pernicious counsel, and learn not to feign sickness again. After this he said, This is not yet enough. I will use the whole town after the same manner if they do not immediately acknowledge Prince Ahmed, my brother-in-law, for their Sultan and Sultan of the Indies. Then all that were present made the air echo again with the repeated acclamation of Long life to Sultan Ahmed, and immediately after he was proclaimed through the whole town. Shebar had him clothed in the royal vestments, installed him on the throne, and after he had caused all to swear homage and fidelity to him, went and fetched his sister Peribenu, whom he brought with all the pomp and grandeur imaginable, and made her be owned Sultana of the Indies. As for Prince Ali and Princess Nouronihar, as they had no hand in the conspiracy against Prince Ahmed, and knew nothing of it, Prince Ahmed assigned them a considerable province with its capital, where they spent the rest of their lives. Afterward, he sent an officer to Prince Hussein to acquaint him with the change, and make him an offer of which province he liked best. But that prince thought himself so happy in his solitude that he bade the officer return the Sultan his brother thanks for the kindness he designed him, assuring him of his submission, and that the only favour he desired of him was to give him leave to retire in the place that he had chosen for his retreat. The 7 Voyages of Sinbad. In the times of Caliph Harun al-Rashid, there lived in Baghdad a poor porter named Hindbad, who, on a very hot day, was sent to carry a heavy load from one end of the city to the other. Before he had accomplished half the distance, he was so tired that, finding himself in a quiet street where the pavement was sprinkled with rosewater and a cool breeze was blowing, he set his burden upon the ground and sat down to rest in the shade of a grand house. Very soon he decided he could not have chosen a pleasanter place. A delicious perfume of aloe wood and pastils came from the open windows and mingled with the scent of the rosewater that steamed up from the hot pavement. Within the palace he heard some music, as of many instruments cunningly played, and the melodious warble of nightingales and other birds. And by this, and the appetizing smell of many dainty dishes of which he presently became aware, he judged that feasting and merrymaking were going on. He wondered who lived in this magnificent house which he had never seen before, the street in which it stood being one which he had seldom occasion to pass. To satisfy his curiosity, he went up to some splendidly dressed servants who stood at the door, and asked one of them the name of the master of the mansion. "What," replied he, "do you live in Baghdad and not know that here lives noble Sinbad the sailor, that famous traveller who sailed over every sea upon which the sun shines?" The porter, who had often heard people speak of the immense wealth of Sinbad, could not help feeling envious of one whose lot seemed to be as happy as his own was miserable. Casting his eyes up to the sky, he exclaimed aloud, "Consider, mighty creator of all things, the difference between Sinbad's life and mine. Every day I suffer 1,000 hardships and misfortunes, and have hard work to get even enough barley bread to keep myself and my family alive, while the lucky Sinbad spends money right and left and lives upon the fat of the land. What has he done that you should give him this pleasant life? What have I done to deserve so hard a fate?" So saying, he stamped upon the ground like one beside himself with misery and despair. Just at this moment, a servant came out of the palace and, taking him by the arm, said, "Come with me. The noble Sinbad, my master, wishes to speak to you." Hindbad was not a little surprised at this summons, and feared his unguarded words may have drawn upon him the displeasure of Sinbad. So he tried to excuse himself upon the pretext that he could not leave the burden which had been entrusted to him in the street. However, the lackey promised him that it should be taken care of, and urged him to obey the call so pressingly that at last the porter was obliged to yield. He followed the servant into a vast room, where a great company was seated around a table covered with all sorts of delicacies. In the place of honour sat a tall, grave man, whose long white beard gave him a venerable air. Beside his chair stood a crowd of attendants, eager to minister to his wants. This was the famous Sinbad himself. The porter, more than ever alarmed at the sight of so much magnificence, tremblingly saluted the noble company. Sinbad, making a sign to him to approach, caused him to be seated at his right hand, and himself heaped choice morsels upon his plate, and poured for him a draught of excellent wine, and presently, when the banquet drew to a close, spoke to him familiarly, asking his name and occupation. "My lord," replied the porter, "I am called Hindbad." "I am glad to see you here," said Sinbad, "and I will answer for the rest of the company that they are equally pleased. But I wish you to tell me what it was that you said just now in the street." For Sinbad, passing by the open window before the feast began, had heard the porter's complaint, and therefore had sent for him. At this question Hindbad was covered with confusion, and, hanging down his head, replied, "My lord, I confess that, overcome by weariness and ill humour, I uttered indiscreet words, which I pray you to pardon me." "Oh," replied Sinbad, "do not imagine that I am so unjust as to blame you. On the contrary, I understood your situation and can pity you. Only you appear to be mistaken about me, and I wish to set you right. You doubtless imagine that I have acquired all the wealth and luxury that you see me enjoy without difficulty or danger. But this is indeed far from the case. I have only reached this happy state after having for years suffered every possible kind of toil and danger. Yes, my noble friends," he continued, addressing the company, "I assure you that my adventures may have been strange enough to deter even the most avaricious men from seeking wealth by traversing the seas. Since you have, perhaps, heard but confused accounts of my 7 voyages, and the dangers and wonders that I have met with by sea and land, I will now give you a full and true account of them, which I think you will be well pleased to hear." As Sinbad was relating his adventures chiefly on account of the porter, he ordered, before beginning his tale, that the burden which had been left in the street should be carried by some of his own servants to the place for which Hindbad had set out first, while he remained to listen to the story. See you tomorrow night.